We've got a couple of people from Australia and around the world. So welcome one and all to this highly anticipated discussion on Beyond Oloroso. Thank you, Daphne, who's also joining us from Bordeaux. So this is very exciting. So we are finally live. This is Charlie Pountney from Ethimex Limited, and I'm joined by Richard Bayles, our head of division for Ethimex Casks. So again, thanks for joining, and I will be sort of moderating this event, this live stream. With Richard is our probably the content expert. We are streaming this now, which is great, but we'll be sending round a copy of the recording to everyone. So if you want to refer back to it, then we'll send it on email. We should have everyone's emails from registering on the LinkedIn event. But we will be taking questions. So if you have any questions as we go, please feel free to put them in the comments section. I will try and feed those in to Rich as we go. But if I don't cover it, I'll try and do it all at the end as well in a short Q&A. We're going to try and keep this to around 45 minutes with a bit of time at the end for Q&A. So as an introduction to who we are here at Ethimex, so we are a specialist in the worldwide bulk distribution of alcohol and specialty spirits. We've been around since 1999. We're a UK privately run company, and we consider ourselves the experts in sourcing of and supplying of global spirits around the world, and also today casks, which brings me nicely on to introducing Richard. Richard is our head of Latin America business at Charles Edge, sourcing projects and the sales operations. He's also a bit of our rum and agave spirit expert, and has been heading up the casks division at Ethimex for over 10 years now. So he's got a lot of experience on barrels and casks, setting up cooperage projects around the world, and he's very familiar and has worked on lots of projects with world famous distilleries around the world for and lots of spirits producers. So we won't spend too long on the backgrounds. To kick off today's session, so Oloroso casks are probably the preeminent, the most common fortified wine cask to be used in spirits maturation, and we're predominantly talking whiskey, I suppose, when we talk about that. The go-to really is Oloroso, but what we wanted to do was take this opportunity to give people a bit more insight into alternatives to Oloroso, because there's a lot of different flavors and styles that can come from looking outside of that Oloroso cask. So we're not going to be doing a super deep dive into chemicals and how it works. This will more just be a kind of gate opening to the different styles, some of the flavors that you can expect to find from the different barrels, giving maybe some inspiration for people who are working at distilleries in NPD, or who are in production, or even in marketing, about kind of maybe some things that other people are doing that might be of interest to you. And we'll talk through some of the different styles, and we'll also Rich and I have also got a few of the samples in front of us to actually help guide us through that, the flavors from the different spirits.
The reason we're tasting today, Charlie, is the only way to explain it is basically what does the, I mean, it sounds pretty obvious, but what does the wine that was in the cask taste like? Because that's effectively, to state the obvious, that's how a whiskey maker or a rum maker can start to think about how that might match.
So we should probably start off here, Rich, by having a little chat about fortified wine in general, what does it mean, and why do fortified wines exist in the first place?
Right, thanks, Charlie, and thanks for having me along. It's a pleasure to be here. Fortified wine, very good question, good starting point. A fortified wine, in simplest terms, is a still wine, or was a still wine, which has had high proof or high strength spirit added to it. There's two principal winemaking reasons why this is done. The first is rooted in history, but we won't go into the history of commerce here. But the first function of adding spirit to a wine basically preserves the wine. It protects the wine from unwanted oxidative effects, which for a still wine is, of course, perhaps turning to acetic acid, vinegar, and further through to ethyl acetate, which you don't want in any significant quantity in a wine. So protecting the wine by adding ethyl alcohol in one form or another, in this case, normally a grape spirit, basically stops those negative oxidative effects and just allows what we might call beneficial, pleasant evolution, oxidative evolution of the fortified wine. And the second reason, which is very important for most, or at least many fortified wines around the world, is arresting the fermentation. So basically, if you put fortified wine, I beg your pardon, a high proof spirit into a wine and take the ABV up to about 15% and above, you're basically interrupting and killing off the yeast at a point where there's still plenty of residual sugar left in the wine or the must. So it's a way of controlling the sweetness levels and creating sweet dessert wines. Now, this doesn't apply by and large to most sherries and a few Madeiras and marsalas, but there are a lot of sweet pudding wines or dessert wines out there which are created using the addition of ethyl alcohol or brandy, and that's basically the second function of fortification.
And should we have a look at where some of these fortified wines come from? We do have some slides which will just help guide us a little bit. And so why don't you talk us through this slide, Rich?
Yeah, sure. This is a very simplified, basic slide, but it just gives you an idea of where fortified wines in Europe are made, and Europe obviously is the sort of the Mecca, if you like, or the original home of fortified wines. As you can see, not surprisingly, you're talking Mediterranean, Southern European countries. The dots in red are the principal and most famous fortified wines or fortified wine categories around the world. Well, around the world, but in this case, they're all in Europe. We've also got, rather again, muscat. We won't forget the Australians. We've got some good USA fortifieds, but we're going to focus mainly on Europe. So you see there, let's go sort of from top to bottom. We've got Vin du Naturel from France. This is a whole category of fortified wines, principally muscats, but also we'll go into that later. Some other grapes. You have Porto, or Port, of course, which is northern Portugal. You have sherry or Jerez and Madeira. And then over to the right, you've got marsala, which is in western Sicily. So these are all principal styles and traditions of fortified wine making, which we'll hopefully go into one by one in a few minutes. By the way, Charlie, the smaller dots, these are other areas where some fortified wines are made, mainly muscats, vermouth as well, which is an aromatized fortified wine, but that's also indicated.
Very good. So without further ado, we are talking about beyond Oloroso in this webinar, but we should at least touch on what is Oloroso and where it's from, how it's made, what flavors would we be expecting from casks?
Sure. Very good place to start. Oloroso is the go-to cask, as you said earlier. There are all sorts of reasons for this, but the most obvious reason is it is the, let's be honest, it's arguably the best cask for finishing a good whiskey, good rums, I've even seen tequilas out there using a bit of Oloroso. We're trying to go beyond Oloroso, as you said, for different reasons, marketing and giving the consumer something different to look at. But yeah, let's look at Oloroso briefly. It's the fully oxidized style of sherry. It's probably the simplest way of putting it. Sherries come in different levels of oxidization, if you like, which we can go into in a few minutes. But Oloroso has been exposed to the elements. It's been exposed to oxygen, to the air, for a long period of time, minimum, typically 10 years minimum, but certainly 20, 30, 40 years and above in a Solera system, which we could look at actually. I think we've got a slide. And so what you get, of course, is that classic Oloroso flavor profile, those dried fruits, the intensity and then the complexity, and obviously the rancio notes, the nuttiness. All of this comes from the highly oxidative style of sherry, which it is. So we're going to move on from Oloroso, Charlie, I think. But that's principally why it's so common out there, because it is a very good sherry. But there's lots of other options that people can look at.
Whilst the slide's up, do we want to talk about the Solera? Is it used for all sherry styles of aging?
It is. It is. The Soleras are usually separate for each style, but they do sometimes move, the contents of one cask from one Solera to another. But generally, the Solera method is used across the sherry region and neighboring regions. One exception sometimes is PX, which is sometimes batch aged, but normally, again, that goes through a Solera system. So yeah, it's the go-to system down there. It's been used for a couple of hundred years. Before that, had different methods. But basically, just to take you through it, it's called in English we call it the Solera system. In Spanish, yeah, but they put more like it's called a criada or criadera system, or criadera and Solera system. It's fairly simple in a sense. The Solera, which basically means the ground level casks, which are all along the floor, they will hold the finished wine, the wine that's ready for bottling. So what happens, sort of working in the wrong direction to a certain extent, but they will take up to 30% of the Solera cask wine and bottle it off, which will allow them to move the same amount of wine from the layer above and bring it down and put it into the Solera cask. And the same goes with the second criadera at the top there. They bring up to 33% per year of that liquid down to the second, the layer below. And this way you get something called, people would call it in perpetuum system, or dynamic aging, or sometimes called fractional blending, particularly in the spirits industry when they use these similar systems for rum and so forth. But it's a very good way of developing particularly oxidized styles, but Fino also uses this system. And it ultimately ends up in a very, very well-aged, old product, because you have literally very tiny amounts, if you like, of very, very old sherry swimming around in the Solera, sometimes up to 100 years old or more.
Wow. And sorry, Rich.
I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I think you explained that really well. And so, how long would these casks be used in a typical cask in a Solera system for? Obviously, it's got very, very, very old liquid in it, but are the casks themselves equally as old?
Yeah, I mean, in fact, Ethimex specializes in ex-Solera or ex-Criadera casks. They're very, very hard to come by. Very small fraction of the cask market would be ex-Criadera casks. We can talk perhaps about seasoned sherry casks later, maybe, if we've got time. But the reason why there are so few casks around now is because there's equilibrium now between the production of sherry and the demand. So there are less of these Criaderas being closed down and sold off. And the barrels in each Criadera can be as young as 10 or 20 years old. But typically they could be 40, 50, 100 years old, even 150. When a barrel falls to bits, that's when they get rid of it, or they get it repaired. And often they repair them. Therefore, some of these barrels are really old. And that's part of the style of sherry. They do not want any wood influence. Sherry and most fortified wines do not seek any wood extractive, which is slightly different from the seasoned cask that we might go into later.
Yeah, and just on Oloroso, the flavors that we would impact from the casks. What would we expect from Oloroso casks?
Yeah, I mean, it's the classic Oloroso profile. This thing in Spanish, but it's also used around the world in France. This concept of rancio literally means rancid in Spanish, but the nuances of meaning. It's a positive thing in the Spanish language in the context of wine. It's these sort of nutty notes coming through, these very complex oxidized notes. So you're going to get that nuttiness, a lot of nuttiness in an Oloroso. But of course, people talk about something like, I hear the word pudding spice mix and Christmas cake used a lot. Yeah, you do get these dark fruit, dried fruit kind of flavors coming through a lot. And that travels very well into the distillate when you're finishing or full term aging using an Oloroso butt. It's a very good profile, particularly for peated malts as well. It's a good marriage.
And it's funny because you associate kind of Oloroso casks with sweetness, with cake, with sticky dried fruit, which actually is not. There's not any sweetness actually coming from the fortified wine itself, is there? Because it's quite a dry spirit.
That's absolutely right. So you're well informed there, Charlie. I have had people, as you say, assuming that sherry is sweet. There's two reasons for that. The first reason, of course, is, as you say, the association with those kind of dried fruit flavors, Christmas cake, nuttiness maybe to a certain extent. But the other reason, I think, of course, is your the sort of back of the drinks cabinet when you were a kid. Particularly if you're from the UK, there was probably a bottle of Bristol cream. That is what they call a sweetened sherry. It's actually a well-made sherry, but it's very kind of out of fashion. But I think that people associate sherry with that sweetened profile. So there's two possibilities there. But you're absolutely right. Sherry is bone dry. It's the driest, I would say, it's the driest of all fortified wine styles. And we're going to run through some of them now. Some of them are slightly drier than others, but they're all devoid of any residual sugar and also not much glycerol, which often gives that sweet sort of rounded feel. So they're very dry.
And interesting that the dryness, actually, the barrels give completely different flavors than you might expect. So we've talked about Oloroso. So let's on the topic of sherry, let's have a think about some of the other types of sherry, and I do have a slide here which Richard kindly put together with a few different other types of sherry. So why don't you start us off there, Richard, with different types of sherry? What makes them different? The production and obviously the casks as well.
Sure. Yeah, slightly in the wrong order, and that's my fault. But Fino and Manzanilla, we'll start with that. This is the opposite extreme of an Oloroso in every sense, including the production methodology. The interesting thing about sherries, we're putting PX to one side because PX is a different animal. But the interesting thing about the dry sherries is they all start with the same grape and the same wine, or very, very similar wine made from the same grape. It's just a question of how they're treated after that and how they're fortified and so forth. So at one end of the scale, I've got a nice bottle here of La Gitana. This is a Manzanilla. Manzanilla and Fino are two styles of what we call biologically aged sherries. Now, they're very similar. We can put them in one category. There are nuances of difference between them. But what happens is the wine, which is produced from the Palomino grape, it normally makes about 10.5 to 11% ABV before fortification, and it's already bone dry at that point. So it's fortified not for its sweetness, or not to maintain its sweetness, but just to, as we said before, to kind of protect it from oxidation. but it's fortified in such a way up to just 15%, which is right at the low end of a fortified wine. And without getting too technical, what this does is we've already killed off the yeast anyway because it's a fully dry wine, but it will still allow another kind of yeast to form on the top of the surface of the liquid in the butt, in the cask. It's called flor. Now, flor is a sort of fluffy, scummy-looking yeast. It looks almost like a mold, and it literally floats on top of the surface, and eventually it covers the whole surface in the barrel, in the cask. Wrong word, cask. And that protects the wine from oxygen completely. It's like almost a hermetic seal, and it lives off the alcohol. It sort of feeds on the alcohol and creates acetaldehyde. Don't want to get too technical, but that gives La Gitana and other kinds of, well, all the Manzaniers and Finos, that very crisp, appley, sharp, zingy character. So yeah, that's called biological aging. Basically, there's no oxidation in the traditional sense, but it is still maturing and developing rancio notes under this veil of flor. So the difference between a Fino and a Manzanier is more or less the location where it's stored. So it's an appellation thing. Manzanier picks up sort of more maritime notes, some salinity from the air. It's definitely detectable. It's not a kind of myth like you get in whiskey. No offense, but it's because it's a wine, it's not distilled. It does pick up salinity. So you get this kind of very savory drink. In fact, Charlie, I think we've got a glass ready. So should we tuck into the Manzanier?
We have a small little Manzanier sherry going.
Yeah, so sun's past the yard arm, so here we go. So what are you getting?
Well, it's really, it's quite dry. It's quite sharp, kind of green apple for sure. A little bit of musty notes.
Yeah,
not like many other sort of aged spirits that are. This is very light and bright and almost slightly acidic. Most spirits and aged spirits are more caramelly, darker, sugary.
Yeah,
so it's very different.
Right, I'll just correct you there, Charlie. You said spirits, but I know you meant wine. We work in spirits, so we're always saying spirit. Yeah. I say that I do the same. But you're right, it's crisp apple. There's a slightly bruised apple note as well, like when apple goes to slightly brown, or when you cut an apple. And that, by the way, is the acetaldehyde, which sort of is a very zippy thing. And the other thing you'll notice is it's bone dry. It really is bone dry. When you say sharp, I think that's a good description, but it's not sharp because of its acidity. Strangely enough, most people would describe this as an acidic wine, but in fact, it's actually quite low acidity. It's just very dry. And one of the reasons is the glycerol has been consumed by the flor as well. So it's taken away all of that sort of rounded sweetness that you get in some wines. So that's it. And it's got a saline character. Did you notice? And also, I would say definitely an umami. I get sort of cheesy notes off this, like a kind of Parmesan. Yeah. I don't know about you. This goes very well with like Spanish ham, Iberico, seafood. So that is a Manzanier, very similar to a Fino, with less of the salinity. Possibly a Fino can be more rounded. Some people might disagree because there's perhaps a touch more glycerol in a Fino, because the flor is less prolific inland, whereas by the sea there's a lot of flor development. Anyway, we won't go into too much detail. The next one,
Rich, just on the casks, because
yes,
it's not. I haven't come across any Fino aged or Manzanilla aged spirits myself, really, but I suppose it's similar to a kind of white wine cask in some ways.
Yes, Fino is a very challenging choice. It's obviously good for ringing the changes, for label marketing, coming up with something new. I don't want to be disparaging, at all, but it's a very difficult finish to try and achieve, because it's such a delicate wine. Delicate's a very good word, so it can get obviously overpowered and completely lost in malt whiskey or in rum. But there again, there are different angles on what a finish is supposed to achieve. You know, is it supposed to demonstrate the characteristic of the previous wine? Is it supposed to be detectable, or is it just supposed to add to the overall profile? And in that case, I'm sure it could serve pretty well. Yeah, and the barrels, well, oh, sorry, I'm talking like, I've talked to a lot of Americans and they always call them barrels. I'll use the word cask. The cask, or the butts, are just typical Solera butts from the Solera system. I think there are some people doing seasoning with Manzanilla nowadays, you know, actually artificially seasoning the cask using the wine rather than a Solera system, just for the whiskey industry. But it's unusual.
So the next sherry that we wanted to talk about, was the Amontillado.
Yeah,
I believe. So what is the difference if we move on to that one?
Right. Well, we've got one poured out here already. Amontillado and also Palo Cortado. We'll move on to that later. These are intermediate styles of sherry. You can think of them as a progression, or a stepping stone on the progression from fino all the way through to a fully oxidized Oloroso. So what happens with Amontillado, and it depends on the winemaker, the bodeguero, as to which wines he think will lend themselves well to an Amontillado style. But normally at on the final Criadera or the Solera stage, so we're talking after several years of the Solera system, the winemaker will decide to fortify the wine further from 15%. You know, this is assuming the Criadera is a fino Criadera, to take it up to something like 17%. And what that does is kills off the floor. So this isn't about killing off the yeast in terms of fermentation. This is about killing off the floor yeast, which immediately or very quickly exposes the wine to oxidation as if it were an Oloroso. So basically it spent most of its life as a fino, and then at the last minute, not literally the last minute, the last few years, it's exposed to the elements, and it, as you might expect, let's taste it, Charlie, because then we can explain it better. But as you might expect, it's a halfway house between the two styles. I mean, on the nose, to me, there's obviously hints that it's oxidized, but there's still quite a bit of a fino type character coming through. It's not that pronounced compared with an Oloroso.
You still get those kind of appley notes.
Totally.
But you also get some raisin, like dark fruit coming through as well.
Yeah, I'm definitely getting the raisins. So that hints that something's happened, but it certainly hasn't got the nose of an Oloroso.
But very good. Very dry as well.
Very dry. It's a very good wine. It's very popular in Spain, along with fino. It's quite an elegant style. But as you can tell, it's a sort of hybrid, if you like, between fino and an Oloroso. And to me, there's a lot of marmalade notes as well, sort of like a Seville orange marmalade.
And would those notes come through in the aging process, do you think?
The aging of spirits, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it's a good alternative for Oloroso if you want something different. If you want to put something fresh and interesting on your label, you know, it's in that category. It's an oxidized wine, partially oxidized. You're definitely going to get marmalade notes and some little bit of nuttiness. Yeah, and raisins. It is a lighter, less pronounced wine. I wouldn't say it's less complex, but it's sort of less in your face compared with an Oloroso. So, you know, whether it would stand up to a sort of heavily peated Islay malt, be an interesting experiment. But certainly for a lot of malt whiskies and rums, I think it's an excellent alternative to Oloroso. So, yeah.
The next one that was on the list was Palo Cortado.
Yeah.
Excuse
well pronounced. That's excellent. Yeah. So Palo can kind of fit quite comfortably in that sort of Amontillado area, that sort of hybrid area between the two. Palo's a little bit different. It's more oxidized, and the reason is, and by the way, traditional Palo is very rare. It's an accident of nature. These are sort of accidental wines that the winemaker discovers in his cellar and is very pleased to find them. Basically, what happens in some Finots, we don't know why, is the floor sometimes just dies or it breaks up. So suddenly, even without the winemaker having noticed, it's been exposed to oxygen and it started to oxidize. So you end up with quite an oxidized style Palo Cortado. It's the closest thing to Oloroso, really, just because it's probably been exposed to oxygen for quite a few years. But there are a lot of bodegas now who are trying to emulate it by actually forcing this phenomena, or blending stuff together to try and emulate that style, and they call that Palo Cortado as well. But the true Palo Cortado is an accidental wine that sits between an Amontillado, which don't forget is fortified in the last few years, and an Oloroso, which is never fortified. Sorry, of course it's fortified, but it's never biologically aged. So what do you think?
You lose the nose that was characteristic of the Manzanillo.
Totally.
And moving towards more darker fruits.
Yeah, it's kind of obvious. Yeah,
caramel, brown sugar.
Absolutely, totally. There's a nuttiness there as well, starting to evolve. So, yeah, I mean, it's just nudging towards an Oloroso. So again, this is an excellent example. The challenge is scarcity of the casks, but it's an excellent example of an alternative to Oloroso. And it is officially a different category from Oloroso, so you can call it Palo Cortado Cask. And it's actually also got those marmalade notes a little bit as well. So it's quite an expensive wine in Spain.
Nice. Finally, then, it's the other probably more well-known sherry style that we see quite a lot in the UK in finishing and aging, Pedro Jimenez.
Yeah, PX, Pedro Jimenez. It's very much an outlier compared with the other sherry types we discussed. It is exposed to oxidative aging, but it's, did we discuss it earlier? It's basically a very high sugar content. Basically, let's try and explain that the PX grape is harvested and put on mats in the sun for 1 to 2 weeks to really basically turn the grapes into raisins, and then the raisins are pressed, so you get this gooey, viscous must, which is much higher in sugar than most wine musts and much more viscous. And in fact, it's so sweet that the fermentation doesn't work very well for a standard table wine. So they fortify it up to 16 or 17% quite early on in the process. So all of that means you're left with a huge amount of residual sugar. I think pretty much in the region of at least 200 grams per litre, sometimes 300, sometimes more. So we're going to taste this in a minute. If you've never tasted PX on its own, you'll either love it or hate it, but it's very distinctive. Let's just have a look at the viscosity of it as well.
It's extremely viscous. It's like a well-made gravy, I would say.
Absolutely, that's a good description.
In your glass, it's incredibly viscous, and it almost looks like gravy as well with how dark it is.
Yeah, so that's all because of the sugar content, of course. I mean, it's raisins, isn't it? It's dates, dried figs. People talk about dried figs. I get prune juice.
Prune juice.
Yeah,
getting kind of molasses treacle
Totally.
that like almost burn.
On the palate, definitely. So this is so far removed from the other sherry styles. It's a real outlier. It's good. It's good, and it's probably a good 18%. Well, actually, this one's a bit lower. This is actually 16%, but typically they can be fortified to a higher degree, and so they're dangerous. You know, you can drink this like it was fruit juice or like it was water. So
yeah,
this is principally used. It's actually grown outside the sherry area, but it's authorized for use in sherry. So in the old days, they used to grow a bit of PX in Jerez, but nowadays it's all grown in Montilla for the sherry industry, and the wines are matured in Jerez. But they're mainly used actually in sweetened sherries. So like I was talking about the Bristol cream or whatever at the back of your drinks cabinet from 1973. This is part of the formula to sweeten the sherry. They take an Oloroso. They'll take in the case of Harvey's, they'll take some PX. They'll also take some Palo Cortado and some Amontillado. So it's quite complex, but the key sweetening ingredient is the PX. And if you want to just put a bit of Oloroso with a bit of PX in your glass, not now, you'll see straight away that you've got a cream sherry. So that's the main use of PX in Jerez, is behind the scenes in the production of higher quality, what they call Oloroso Dulce, or cream sherries.
It's certainly something that I could drink a lot of. And so, if we talk about PX casks, are these typically coming from the Solera? Are they seasoned? How are you sourcing these?
Well, as I said, Ethimex tends to specialize. We're very unusual, quite niche. We tend to specialize in ex-criadera, ex-solera casks wherever possible. Ethimex doesn't really get involved in seasoned casks. It's more of our model, as a business decision. We do sometimes get involved, set projects up. But in the PX casks that we supply are from Solera, and occasionally from non-Solera type production systems outside of Jerez in Montilla. But yeah, they're basically traditional casks. They're not seasoned casks, the ones that we supply. However, the majority of PX casks, I think, are probably seasoned, which, for those who don't know, is basically taking a new barrel, newly made by a cooperage, and sticking Oloroso or PX or whatever sherry in it, a young sherry, always a young sherry because otherwise it's too expensive, and sticking sherry in it for between 12 to 24 months. So it drinks into the wood and, you know, seasons the cask.
When you getting that seasoned cask, which you said was typical for you know, let's say a whiskey distillery to source it, there will be a fair amount of that sticky sweet PX in the staves from the absorption, which over time will influence the flavor and the color of whatever you're aging in those casks, right? So would it impact the flavor in terms of it's going to add all these raisiny sweeter notes?
Yeah, totally. To be honest, 12, 18 months to me is not enough for PX. It's a very viscous wine. It takes a little bit longer to sort of get deep into the stave, which is what we refer to in the industry as in drink. And typically, just so you know, I mean, in a bourbon barrel, you might get 5 or 6 liters of in drink. Some studies have been done, which is how much spirit, if you like, is locked into the wood in an empty cask that's been used. In the case of the wines, I imagine it's something similar. You might, in a massive sherry butt, you might be expecting 10 liters or so, maybe quite a bit more, to be locked into the wood. And that can diffuse out, of course, during the aging, the spirit's aging cycle. And yeah, that's exactly how it works. It would draw out the in drink, the PX in drink in this case, into the whiskey. There is sometimes residual wine in the barrel when people receive them at the distillery. I can't remember the regulations around it. I don't, but sometimes there's a little bit of a freebie at the bottom of the barrel, so that might help some of the distillers. In America, they love that because there's certainly no regulations. They just slap in the spirit and it blends with some of the wine. Canada might be a bit more controversial in Scotland.
Just we've got another question from Vin. Just whilst we wrap up the sherry kind of chapter, he's saying that he always gets a lot of sulfur from sherry influenced whiskey. Do you have any idea where that might come from?
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. I mean, it's obviously affects all wines. It comes from the SO2, the sulfites. I'm not a chemist. I always get the two a bit mixed up. But basically, during the wine making process to preserve the wine, to preserve the must, sulfur still has to be used. It is a nightmare for distillers because it doesn't really matter so much in the wine industry, but when it goes through into the distillate, it's not a note you really want in your whiskey or your rum. But yeah, it basically comes from the vinification process, or the viticulture and the vinification process. Sulfur is a very persistent, low threshold. Sulfur compounds are very low threshold, so they're very easily detectable. We generally spot test our casks for sulfur. We have distillers that are worried about sulfur or sulfates. So we do take a look at the wine itself that came from the barrel and test it for sulfur. Not always, but if we're asked to, or as a spot process occasionally. But generally, we have some very good bodegas and suppliers, partners that have a good eye for that problem.
So it's not really necessarily a fault of anyone's or from the distilleries. It's just a part of the wine production that they use sulfur or sulfites, and that often will then continue through to the end maturation of whiskey or whatever it might be.
Yeah, I'd say so. I haven't discussed it at length with the bodegueros. If having more sulfur than less sulfur is a bad thing, a poor approach or not. Sulfur is generally widely accepted in the wine industry as I wouldn't even say a necessary evil. It's just a ubiquitous thing. It's just when we move along to the distillation industry, it becomes a problem. So I wouldn't say it's a fault in sherry, but it's not particularly detectable. It's normally at low levels. Yeah.
I hope that answers your question, Vin. Now you know. So, okay, the next sort of chapter, I suppose, is moving away from sherry and towards other fortifieds. So the first one we're going to talk about, Rich, is port. And port is probably quite a bit more common in for whiskey aging. Definitely seen some port finishes. So tell us a little bit about the differences, production, and how the barrels. Yeah,
sure. Well, port's quite different in many ways to the other fortified wines, particularly to sherry. I'm not just talking about the style, which we'll go into, but also the fact that port is effectively a blended product. It's a blended product made from lots of different grapes that all grow often in the same field. The list of grapes that you find in Douro, which is where port grapes are grown, is not quite endless, but it's a very long list. And then maybe 5, 6, 7 famous, widely found varieties. And also the wines themselves are blended between different years, different distillery, different wineries. So it's a very blended product. So that's one of the main differences. The other, compared with sherry, is port is a sweet wine. Port has its Its fermentation interrupted quite early on, maybe halfway through, sometimes earlier, to preserve the freshness of the red grapes. I haven't talked about the actual color. Basically, port is a belting, strong red wine before it's even fortified. Think of I don't know, well, Douro wines, if you're familiar with Douro wines, or maybe Toro from Spain, just up the river. These are very strong, characterful, fruity red wines. So one of the purposes of the fortification step, apart from keeping the wine sweet, is to also preserve that red fruit. It's a fairly rapid fermentation process with the skins, so that brings in a lot of phenolics, including tannins, into the wine, and color, of course. Great. I mean, anyone who's seen ruby port, it really is bright red ruby. So that intervention with high proof spirit basically preserves the color. Now, we're not going to go into all the different styles of port, and the reason is there are only two important styles when it comes to casks, as opposed to all the other styles of port that you see on the shelves. You've got late bottled vintage, you've got vintage ports, of course. These are all aged in the bottle. So the winemaker doesn't do the aging. It's actually the consumer or the supply chain that does the aging. They develop in the bottle. But the two exceptions to this, if you like, are ruby port. So ruby port is traditionally aged in huge oak vats, massive 30,000, 25,000 litre oak vats, sometimes a bit smaller. There's no wood influence at all, because it's just simply the wood is already well seasoned, but it's also a huge vat, not much surface area. But things are changing, and a lot of people in the port industry deny this or don't mention it because it goes against their storyline. But there are definitely smaller producers further inland that are using smaller casks. And does that introduce some wood to the port? I mean, they try not to. They season the casks for 2 or 3 years with normal table wine. And that's actually part of the winemaking process for still wines. And then they take the barrels, which have been used for red wine, and start using them for tawny port. And that way, a lot of the tannins and a lot of the spice and the vanilla or whatever has already been drawn out. But they are starting to use smaller barrels for ruby port making. And then the other style of port is tawny port. Tawny port is similar to a ruby when it starts. The winemaker may adjust the process slightly, but basically, you're basically putting a kind of ruby port into a much bigger cask, but it's not a huge vat. It's actually a cask. It's about 600, 650 litres. It's called a port pipe. This is the traditional method, and that exposes what is effectively a kind of ruby port to oxidation. Again, we're into that oxidative territory. So across typically 8 to 10 years, you're starting to see what they'd call a young tawny port develop. And then much older versions of tawny port can be left in the barrel for 20, 30, 40 years. And the oxidation obviously changes the character as you go along. But again, some smaller winemakers are using smaller barrels, like 225 litre wine type barrels, to age their tawny port now, but it's still done in the oxidative style. So those are the two principal port styles that are relevant to wood. There should be no influence of wood on tawny or ruby port, and the winemakers try to avoid this, but nevertheless they do use casks.
So the casks which you find for maturing spirits are these smaller ones on the secondary market from the more independent, smaller producers, not these huge 20,000 litre vats, I'm assuming.
No, the vats never come out. I've never seen one on the market. I'm sure some people would like to get their hands on them for a wash back or whatever, but no. Yeah, basically the adegas, as they're called, which is like a bodega in Portuguese, they never really get rid of their casks. They're very hard to come by, these pipes, these 600 litre casks. tend to send them out for repair, bring them back again. 2 reasons. One is wanting to hang on to something very traditional. 3 reasons, in fact. The second is just economics. It's better to get it repaired than buy a new one. And third is they just want to hang on to wood that's been really, really well seasoned, so there's no oak influence. And obviously these really old pipes have got no oak components to give anymore. They're just an oxidative aging vessel. But yeah, in terms of the real world, most of the barrels we're getting are the smaller ones. They're really good for finishing spirits, of course. That's both Tawny and Ruby. These tend to be 225 litre barrels because there's a few cooperages in Portugal making new barrels in the Bordeaux style. So as I said, they're used for 2 or 3 years for making conventional wine, and then they're moved across to the port bodegas for things like Tawny and Ruby production. But the big pipes, we sent a few to the Caribbean, to Barbados quite recently, the big 650 litre pipes. We've been doing that for many years. So we do get pipes, but they're few and far between.
And so what influence on spirit would you get from these fortifieds?
Let's taste the Ruby port.
Yeah.
So the Ruby, this is actually a reserva, which means it's been in cask for a little while. Some of the best Ruby ports are the simplest ones, really young, really fresh. But this has had a bit of time to settle and marry, and you wouldn't see much oxidative action because it's in such a big tank, and that's the whole point. When it's in smaller pipes, it converts to Tawny, but when it's in these big balseros, it stays more fruity.
Don't get a huge amount. Yeah, don't get a huge amount of those interesting oxidation characters on the nose, as you said, but on the palate, it's like super berry, like really strong berry flavor.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, you're getting red fruits here. You're getting sometimes raspberries, but you're definitely getting. I'm always thinking red plum, and even dark plum, like Victoria plums. I don't know if guys around the world know what they are, but there's a lot of plum going on there. Cherry as well. These kind of dark red and black fruits, but it's very fresh and lively, a little bit sharp, a little bit prickly. But this is prickly is not the word really, but it's quite fiery relatively to a Tawny port, which you'll soon see the difference between the two.
A balance between those more red currant, brighter, more citrusy berry notes and then you also get the darker plum, cherry for sure as well.
You can sometimes get a little bit of I'm not getting it here, but you sometimes get sort of floral notes, sort of herbaceous green and floral, mainly floral notes actually, sort of like bergamot as well. I'm not getting it on this example, but yeah. Okay. Let's try the Tawny port, Charlie.
Yeah, you can immediately get more of that oxidation, more of on the Tawny that I've just poured.
Yeah. For those who are interested, this is a Pacheca 10-year-old. So this is a young Tawny port. That doesn't mean it's young. It's obviously 10 years old. But most Tawny ports wouldn't be bottled till about 7 or 8 years old. And also it's important to realize 10 years is they call it an average age. It doesn't quite work like that, but it's not specifically 10 years old. It's judged by the authorities in Portugal to have the characteristics of a 10-year-old port. So it means there could be some 9-year-old in there, 11-year-old. It's a blend. So I'm just going to taste that.
This for me has got a lot more character.
Yeah. Wow, you see, I do love a Tawny port. Yeah.
More interesting nose with those kind of, I can't think of a better word apart from like musty, but
Yeah,
The
there's must and there's, you've got cooked fruit. For me, it's a sort of cooked and dry fruit coming along.
And there's just so much more complexity in the palate as well. It's lighter but more robust, but also got a lot more flavors going around. Whereas the Ruby was, big and fruity, like a kind of like a Malbec or a big bold red wine. And this is like a more mature, lighter, but like a Pinot Noir, but just with more going on. It's quite interesting.
I know what you're saying. Absolutely, it's got that complexity, and it's also got a sort of balsamic feel to it.
Yeah.
But so Tawny Port. I mean, they're both different animals. They're both great fortified wines. I would drink Tawny Port over Ruby, and most people would. It's more expensive. It's older, but it's a different style. But the question is for whiskey makers and rum makers, using Ruby Port can yield pretty impressive results, and also you get that great color boost from casks that have had Ruby Port in them. I mean, we're working with some guys in Jalisco, and their tequila that's just reposado is coming out like a rosé. It's beautiful.
Yeah.
What are we looking at there?
Color, you can see that this is the Ruby, this is the Tawny. See, big difference. The Tawny delicious. There's hands down. Yeah. We should. I think we've spent a bit of time on that, so I think we should move on to the Madeira. Rich,
speed things up a bit if we have to, which I think is a good idea. So the Madeira. Let's move on to Madeira.
Yeah.
Madeira's. Let's focus on the interesting, distinguishing, characteristics of Madeira compared with other fortified wines. Madeira's. We haven't got time to go into the history, but for historical reasons, they decided. Let me go briefly into the history. Madeira used to be shipped around the world along with a lot of fortified wines, but Madeira in particular used to cross the Atlantic to the southern states, to the Caribbean, to Brazil. For the sailors and also to sell in these colonies. And they soon discovered that when they used it as ballast on these small ships, it was often on the open deck. And the heat of the tropical and Mediterranean sun basically started cooking the wine over many months. And when they got to the destination, or sometimes they had a bit of cargo coming back, a few barrels left, it was noted that it had taken on some amazing cooked, what they call Madeirized characteristics. So the Portuguese basically said, we like this. It became a very popular style, and they started to emulate the heating process in their wineries. So they used to leave they still leave barrels, if you like, casks of Madeira in very warm parts of the winery, in the loft or under the eaves, to basically cook the wine in very high temperatures, 35, 40 degrees, 50 degrees. They also have a sort of speeded up process for the cheaper Madeiras, not bad Madeiras, but not the super high end ones, where they actually heat the tank using coils, pipes of I think it's hot water or steam to heat the tank. It's normally a stainless steel tank, so it's not relevant to what we're talking about today, but it gives that kind of Madeirized, which basically means a sort of not just oxidized, but a cooked oxidized character to the wine. And that's a unique methodology for Madeira wines. So you have different grapes. There's Cercial, which is not exactly like Fino, but you can consider it the Madeira equivalent of a Fino. It's dry. It's almost, occasionally it's off dry, but it's normally bone dry, maybe 5 grams per liter of residual sugar. Then you have Verdelho, you have Boal, and finally, perhaps the most famous is Malvasia, but it's called by the English historically Malmsey wine. in the 17th, 18th century, everyone would have known what Malmsey wine is. Nowadays, it's less well known. But Malmsey or Malvasia is a very sweet Madeira wine. So you have all these different levels of sweetness, from dry to kind of off dry, through to quite sweet, which is Bayles, and then Malmsey, which is the sweetest of them all. I think possibly 100, 120 grams per litre of residual sugar. But they're all aged, unless I'm mistaken, but from what I've understood over the years, they're all aged in the same way, heated in a system called estufagem, which basically means like kilns or ovens, or I think it's called candeiro, but I might be wrong. It is the more traditional system where they don't use any intervention. They just use the natural heat. Don't forget, this is a subtropical island with temperatures all year round, warm temperatures. So that is Madeira. And where's the bottle? I think we should taste it.
Mm.
So here's an example. This is just a 5-year-old Reserva or Reserva. It doesn't say on the bottle, but I'm pretty sure this is a Malmsey or Malvasia. It might not be the sweetest Malvasia because it's kind of, I did taste it earlier, this one, or yesterday. So it's kind of, but are you getting those really cooked, stewed like apricots? And if you imagine literally throwing a load of fruit into a pan and cooking them down, and that sort of compote kind of.
The nose we've gone kind of back to the sherry. You know, we went away from the port. It was, and the PX was very different, but from a profile perspective, it's gone way back to much more like the Palo Cortado or something like that.
Absolutely, you're right. People equate the two quite often, along with marsala. We're going to look at that again in a minute. Look at that in a minute. But of course, the big difference here is this is sweet compared with the Oloroso. So you get a bit of a surprise, which brings us to the point. This is a good alternative to Oloroso or Amontillado, but it's got sweet, depending on the variety, as we said. If it's Malmsey, it's got that sweetness that will also come through into the distillate. The challenge is availability of Madeira casks is quite limited, and availability of specific types of Madeira cask, they're not always there when you want them. But the whole range of Madeira profiles is very exciting for the whiskey maker. Yeah. And also, we sent a lot of these.
Sorry, Richard.
Also, we've sent quite a lot of Madeira casks recently to the Caribbean distillers, Barbados, a few other islands, a few other distillers. So it's working pretty good for the rum guys out there.
We had a really lovely whiskey Madeira finish the other day. Do you remember?
Yes,
it was delicious.
I do, and I remember the profile very clearly, but I can't remember the distillery. Anyway, yeah.
In the bottler, but I'm getting a lot of pear on like sweet pear drops, kind of like the ripe pear.
Yeah, you're getting a lot of these kind of caramelization and Maillard reaction type flavors as well. You know, if you're talking about caramelized flavors, literally Madeira is actually heating the wine, so it's not just a sort of semblance. It's the real thing. These are very caramelized type flavors.
So moving on to the next one is marsala.
Okay. So marsala, one of my favorite wines, also one of the most unknown, if you like, of the four or five main categories, which is such a shame because marsala wine in the heyday of fortified wines. By the way, the Brits, for example, used to have 75% of the wine drunk in the UK, or even before it was the UK, was fortified wine, particularly ports, sherries, marsalas, Malaga, muscats. So what happened with Marsala, we don't really know. Basically, they've fallen out of fashion, fallen out of favor. They're still going. They're producing some fantastic wines down there for the local market, for the international market, and of course, they work with us for the whiskey sector regarding their used casks. So Marsala is some very interesting styles of wine. There's sort of three ways of categorizing a Marsala wine, and when you sort of interplay the three different ways of defining them, you get a whole combination of different wines and different descriptions, if you like. So first of all, you can define it by color, or you might say winemaking method. So ambra, which means amber, has had some cooked grape must added to it, unfermented grape must, to give it color. So that's oro is gold. Rubino is a lot of people don't realize, but there is a rubino, which basically means ruby again. There is a ruby style of marsala, and there's vergine, which basically means virgin, and I'll explain why it's called that in a minute. The second categorization would be on the sweetness level. So you have, let me think, you have secco. Anyone who speaks Italian here, or Spanish, French, even Portuguese, will know that means dry. There's semi-secco, obviously semi-dry, and there's dolce, as in dolce vita, you know, sweet. Basically, you've got all these different combinations of wines, lots of different styles coming out of the same grape, which is principally Grillo, Grillo, but there are 4 or 5 other grapes that they use. Grillo is a white grape. The Rubino uses different indigenous red grapes, mainly Nero d'Avola, which you may have heard in Sicilian still wine. It's a great grape. And so Marsala is a real hidden gem. It was less hidden in the past, but it seems to be quite hidden now. We work a lot in Marsala with the different cantine, which basically means bodegas. And should we taste it then, Charlie, again? And let's just talk us through. So here we have Tenute Orestiari. I don't know these guys too well, but I think they're quite a major producer. This is Marsala Vergine. Now, Vergine means they can't add any of this cooked grape must at the beginning for color and for flavor. This is basically I wouldn't say unadulterated. Let's just say it's not been touched. It's just been aged oxidatively in a. Normally, if it's a Vergine, it's in a Solera type system called in perpetuum, which is basically a Solera. And Vergine has to be 5 years old. If it's Vergine Stravecchio, it would be 10 years old. So let's try that quickly, Charlie.
It's got. I'm trying to identify the nose. It's got something really distinctive that I can't identify.
Well, you're getting these rancio notes. You can liken it to your Malmsey, definitely to your Spanish style sherries, but you're right. There's a sort of, well, I think what you're detecting, and when you taste it, there's a zinginess to it, isn't there? There's a sort of tart zinginess.
Definitely tart.
People are like, yeah, and it's interesting you should pick that up because that's very spot on. People talk about tamarind. So you get all these sort of notes of apricots and all the usual sort of rancio notes, but also a hint of this sort of tamarind, a sort of zingy, tart kind of note. Now that's pretty dry. It doesn't say on the label, but I would say that was probably a semi-secco. It could even be a kind of secco. But these are superb casks for finishing your rum or your whiskey, your tequila. I mean, really, as well, I think it'd be nice to put Marsala a bit more on the map. It is a superb, noble wine that's kind of been left behind, possibly largely because of its geography out there on the tip of Sicily. So, you know, I definitely recommend a Marsala finish, and we can help you with that.
Then I think we've probably just got a couple more. The next one was muscat. If you wouldn't mind,
Yes.
just
Muscat. We've got a glass here. So muscat is a very interesting grape. In fact, it's not a grape, it's a family of grapes, which are all kind of similar in their characteristics. It's widely used in France for vin du naturel, which we'll go into in a minute. There are several varieties, but the two principal ones you'll find around the world in quality VDN or fortified winemaking would be the muscat blanc du petit vin, which is basically literally translated, it's a white small berry muscat. That's what it's called. Those produce the finest muscats in most people's opinion in places like muscat, in places like Baume de Venise in the Rhone, southern Rhone, in the Roussillon area. The thing is not too relevant to what we're talking about because there are very few of those muscats that are actually aged in oak. They're normally bottled fresh, zingy, fruity, and young. But they are fortified wines. Again, it's just not too relevant to the wood side of what we're talking about today. So we have to go further afield from France to really look at how muscat is used in slightly different contexts. So you've got here in the list, actually, in front of us, we've got Moscatel de Setúbal, which is from just south of the Lisbon area in Portugal, and also Moscatel do Douro, which is made in the same area as port wine. So these Moscatel, they're, by the way, Moscatel, Muscat, Moscato, it's all the same. It's just different languages for the same grape, yeah, Muscat. When you age it oxidatively in a hot climate, in wood, for several years, the difference between a fresh, zingy Muscat de Baume de Venise, for example, and a Setúbal is huge. So if we just taste this one we've got here, Charlie. So this is a oxidative style Muscat. This is actually, I haven't touched upon Montilla because it's very closely related to sherry and it's next door, but this is actually Montilla. But this is very similar to what you'd call Malaga Muscat, which is slightly further south. So it's been oxidatively aged. So you've got these amazing fruity flavors still. Yeah, you're getting definitely apricot, even strangely enough, a bit of orange, which is not always that common. But you're getting those, I don't know, cooked and rancio flavors as well, you know. In fact, you're heading towards kind of PX territory, don't you think?
Is there? Did you say there's sugar added? Because it's very
never sugar added. No, it's there can be, but then it wouldn't be a fortified wine. So no, in this case, in this particular style, the fermentation is interrupted by the addition of alcohol. When I say alcohol, it's grape spirit, and that's basically why it's so deliciously sweet. It's good, huh? It's really good. There's so much going on. So I'd always recommend Muscat as a finish. You know, instead of PX, there's more fruitiness. PX have got these prunes and dried raisins. This is in a sort of not too old oxidized Muscat. You're still getting, you know, what are you getting there? Apricots and maybe melons. Well, mango even. These kind of tropical fruit notes.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. The orange and apricot is really, it almost reminds me a little bit of Grand Marnier. You know, it's like a liqueur, like an orangey liqueur. But not quite as sweet as that. It's really nice.
Yeah, that surprised me actually. There is definitely orangey notes to this. You don't always get them in this particular, you know, type of Muscat, but it can come through, and it's very clear in this version. So these are aged in sometimes in Solera type butts, sometimes in smaller casks, all around the sort of Andalusia area. If we could just go back to the slide, Charlie, I don't know if you could take me back. briefly, we have Zibibbo. Now, Zibibbo is actually Muscat, Alexandria Muscat, which is the second most common Muscat grape. And by the way, the one we just tasted is also Alexandria Muscat, or Muscat d'Alexandrie. It's got names in different languages. So Zibibbo is actually the local name for what we call a Muscat of Alexandria. And very close to marsala, in fact. Those wines are oxidatively aged, sometimes younger as well, younger wines, but it's a fortified muscat. And we supply not a lot of those casks, but we do supply quite a few around the world. And then at the bottom there, for our Australian friends, we've got Rutherglen Muscat. I mean, it's, it might upset the French, but it's arguably the king of muscats. And it's got a longer history than people realize. I think over here in Europe, we tend to think the New World is new. Rutherglen was actually founded, the first Rutherglen Muscat was founded, I think, by the guy who started Penfolds wine. And I think for many years, they just produced these sweet wines, which the Australians call stickies. So they've been produced down in Australia, emulating the European way of doing things for, a good 150 years or so. And Rutherglen Muscat is a very expensive, very, very limited volume wine. If you ever get a chance to try something like a grand Rutherglen, which I think is 10 years old or older, these are amazing wines. You're getting these kind of characteristics, but just, something even more special. Those barrels are very rare. We do get some every year, but very, very, very few. So we can't always guarantee supply of those casks, but it's always worth asking.
Great. We did have another slide for other fortifieds, like vermouth, for instance.
Yeah, shall I run you very quickly? I get the sense we're under time pressure, but Grenache VDN is also from the same regions of France as more or less as the Muscat VDNs, Vin du Naturel. But Grenache is a red grape, Garnacha in Spanish. And these wines are very interesting. They're fortified to leave residual sweetness, and then they're oxidatively aged. A lot of them are aged. You've got, for example, Banyuls down on the Spanish border there, and Muscat de Rivesaltes. Muscat de Rivesaltes is a muscat, beg your pardon, Rivesaltes, which is next door. And these are really great wines with rancio notes. They're oxidatively aged. So those are interesting. They're not all aged in barrels or barrique, but some of them are. And we do occasionally get Grenache VDN barrels. Commanderia, have a look into it on the internet. Fascinating history. It's some people would say it's the oldest wine in the world, sweet wine. Goes back something like 3,000 years or something insane. The Spanish would probably argue that Jerez is older, but anyway, it's a classic wine made from a local grape called can't remember the name, begins with an X, very complicated Greek name, Zinisteri, that's it, Zinisteri. And it's a beautiful wine. It's very similar in many ways to a muscat, a fortified muscat, and those are aged in barrels for at least 2 or 3 years and a lot more. And vermouths, finally, this is a aromatized wine, so it's sort of fiddled around with a lot more than a natural fortified wine by the addition of botanicals, maceration normally. There's some sort of distillations going on in some of the production techniques, but vermouth obviously traditionally comes from the north of Italy and also parts of France. And quinquina, very closely related to vermouth, but the principal flavoring ingredient is quinine, or in fact cinchona bark. But I think some French brands put a bit of quinine in there now, which is an extract from the cinchona bark. So those barrels are very hard to come by, but occasionally we do have some classic brands of quinquina would be something like Lillet or Quina Lillet. If you know James Bond, that's part of the Vesper Martini formula. So those are actually aged in barrique, in barrels. Not all vermouth is. In fact, only a tiny amount of vermouth is aged in oak barrels. Normally it's aged in big vats. But we can supply vermouth barrels. Vermouth rosso, red vermouth, It's not from red grapes. It's actually a style of vermouth that's been sort of aged in cask, so it takes on a lot of colour. So it becomes known as red vermouth, but it's not actually a red wine. It's a white wine base. And I think that brings us to the end of all the fortified wines, Charlie, to be honest. There you go.
Well, yeah, that maybe took slightly longer than we anticipated, but I think we went into quite a bit of detail. So hopefully that was useful for everyone. We gave you some good ideas. It is true, I think, to say that casks are a little bit of a minefield for purchasing from distilleries and things for aging. And one of the things we've seen is some slightly unscrupulous sellers of casks or brokers of casks. So, Rich, would you, a specialist in the area, could you give us a breakdown on how you source your casks and assure their quality?
Well, that's yeah, you're absolutely right, Charlie, and that's Ethimex's business. Ethimex Cask. We're here to we're still here selling casks because we sell good quality casks. Sourcing casks is a minefield. Even Ethimex Cask learnt the hard way in the early days, 10 years ago. There's a lot of unscrupulous brokers, no names mentioned. No, it's just a minefield out there. When you visit cooperages and wineries, you will see a lot of old casks kicking around, dry, musty. So you've got to be careful you're not dealing with people who will pass those casks off by sticking a bit of port in them for a month as port barrels. It may even be true they may be port barrels or they may be sherry barrels, but they're not good quality ones. You're going to end up with problems. There's risk of things like geosmin, sulfur as well, as the gentleman said, in low quality barrels. There's all sorts of little minefields. And one of the other big problems is when a barrel's left empty, it can acetify, which basically means it develops acetic acid in the staves and on the residual wine that's on top of the staves. That can happen quite quickly because there's no protection from the alcohol, not much, because it's exposed to the elements, the alcohol's evaporated. So you tend to get a bit of acetic acid, and that can develop quite quickly into ethyl acetate through oxidation. So you're going to end up with vinegar, and if you're lucky, in inverted commas, vinegar with nail polish remover kind of solventy smells. And a lot of poor quality Oloroso barrels sourced from the wrong place in the wrong way, or left empty for too long, this is what you could end up with. So Ethimex manages these risks through our knowledge and through our experience, and above all through our relationships with wineries, bodegas, workshops. And just to explain briefly, actually, Charlie, as you know yourself, how we operate our model at Ethimex Cask, we're kind of lucky, and I suppose that's how we came into existence. We're kind of lucky that Ethimex Ethimex Alcohol and Spirits division, exists because we have great access into many distilleries around the world, many wineries, both as customers and suppliers. Don't forget, wineries, for example, use high proof grape spirit for their fortification. So even outside the world of fortified wines, we have excellent access, relationships, and what we would call privileged access to cask that most barrels brokers don't really have, because there's less of that two-way business relationship. So we can access cask from wineries and particularly distilleries almost to the extent where we can roll up and select. But they know what we're looking for, and they know what we like and don't like. So that's where we're very different from almost every other barrel supplier. And it's done us very well. We move several tens of thousands of barrels a year.
So all that remains really is to say thank you to everyone for bearing with us, for joining. We hope you have been, slightly entertained or at least informed of some options for aging spirits in some different types of casks, which are out there and that are available through Ethimex. Got a comment from Vin again saying, thanks a lot. Fortified wine is not something I've explored in great detail. So that was really enlightening. So thanks guys.
Thanks, Vin.
Take care and have a good evening wherever you are.